The telegram arrived 3 days after they buried Thomas Kennedy in the dusty earth outside Deadwood, South Dakota. But Adelaide Kennedy never opened it because she could not bear to read one more piece of bad news in a world that had already taken everything from her. She stood in the small boarding house room with her hands pressed against her swollen belly, 5 months along, and showing enough that the whispers had started following her down the street like shadows at high noon. The year was 1881, and the Black Hills were still wild enough that a woman alone might disappear into the mountains and never be heard from again, which seemed preferable to facing another day of pitying looks and closed doors. Thomas had been a good man, maybe too good for the rough life of a prospector, and the cave in that killed him had been quick at least. The mine foreman had told her that much while pressing $20 into her hand, compensation he called it, though they both knew it would not last more than a few weeks. She had tried to find work, but no one wanted to hire a pregnant woman, especially not one whose husband had been dead less than a week. The boarding house keeper had already given her notice. 3 more days, and then she would be out on the street with winter coming down from the mountains like a wolf with its teeth bared. Adelaide walked to the window and looked out at the muddy street below. Wagons rolled past, their wheels cutting deep ruts in the October mud. Miners stumbled from saloon to saloon, spending their gold dust on whiskey and card games. She watched a woman in a red dress call out to them from a doorway, and Adelaide wondered how long it would be before she ended up in a similar doorway, doing whatever it took to survive. The thought made her sick, but she had learned in the past few days that desperation had a way of rewriting a person's moral boundaries. The knock on her door came just after sunset. She opened it to find Mrs. Harrison, the boarding house keeper, standing in the hallway with her lips pressed into a thin line that Adelaide had come to recognize as her particular expression of moral disapproval. "There is a man downstairs asking for you," Mrs. Harrison said, her voice clipped. "I told him it was not proper for him to call on a recently widowed woman, but he insisted. Says he knew your husband." Adelaide's heart jumped. Perhaps Thomas had been owed money, or perhaps there was something she could sell, some piece of equipment or claim that might buy her a few more weeks. She followed Mrs. Harrison down the narrow stairs to the parlor, where a tall man stood with his hat in his hands, turning it slowly as he examined the faded wallpaper. He was maybe 30 years old, lean and weathered in the way of men who spent their lives outdoors. His dark hair was a bit too long, curling at his collar, and his face was clean-shaven, showing a strong jaw and eyes that were an unusual shade of gray-green, like sagebrush after rain. He wore the clothes of a working cowboy, though Adelaide could not imagine what a cowboy was doing in the mining district of the Black Hills. His boots were dusty from travel, and there was a gentleness in the way he held himself that seemed at odds with the rough company he must have kept. "Mrs. Kennedy," he said, his voice low and respectful. "My name is Graham Porter. I worked with your husband last year down in Cheyenne before he came north to try his luck in the mines. I only just heard about what happened, and I wanted to pay my respects." Adelaide studied him, trying to remember if Thomas had ever mentioned a Graham Porter. Her husband had not spoken much about his time in Wyoming, and she had not pressed him. A man's past was his own business out here, and women who asked too many questions often learned things they would rather not know. "That is kind of you, Mr. Porter," she said carefully. "Thomas never mentioned you, I am afraid." "No reason he would have," Graham said. "We worked cattle together for a few months, that is all. But he was a good man, and when I heard about the accident, I felt like I should come see if there was anything I could do to help his widow." Mrs. Harrison made a small disapproving sound in her throat. Well, you have paid your respects, Mr. Porter. I am sure Mrs. Kennedy appreciates it, but she has much to do and it is getting late. Graham looked at Adelaide, and she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. It was not pity exactly, though there was compassion there. It was more like recognition, as if he saw something in her that he understood from his own life. "Mrs. Kennedy," he said quietly, "might I speak with you privately for a moment? I promise it will be brief and entirely proper." Mrs. Harrison opened her mouth to object, but Adelaide spoke first. "We can step onto the porch, Mr. Porter. Mrs. Harrison, would you be so kind as to chaperone from the doorway?" The older woman could hardly refuse without being openly rude, so she nodded stiffly and followed them out to the narrow porch that ran along the front of the boarding house. Adelaide pulled her shawl tighter against the evening chill and waited for Graham to speak. He was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the darkening street. When he finally spoke, his voice was even lower than before, pitched so only she could hear. "Mrs. Kennedy, I am going to be direct with you because I do not think either of us has time for dancing around the truth. I heard in town that you are with child and that you are being put out of your lodging. I heard that you have been unable to find work and that you have nowhere to go." Adelaide felt her face flush hot with shame. "The people in this town certainly like to gossip," she said, her voice tight. "They do," Graham agreed. "But in this case I am glad they do because it brought me here. Mrs. Kennedy, I have a proposition for you and I want you to hear me out before you refuse. Mr. Porter, if you think that I am so desperate that I would agree to anything improper, you are mistaken. I may be poor, but I still have my dignity." "I know you do," he said quickly. "And what I am proposing has nothing to do with anything improper. Mrs. Kennedy, I want to marry you." Adelaide stared at him, certain she had misheard. "I beg your pardon. I want to marry you," he repeated. "A legal marriage properly done with a preacher and witnesses. I want to give your child my name and a home to grow up in. I have a ranch down in Wyoming, not far from Cheyenne. It is not a big spread, but it is good land with water year-round, and the house is sound. I have been running it alone for 3 years now, and I could use a wife." "You want to marry a pregnant widow you have never met before tonight," Adelaide said, her voice rising despite her efforts to keep it level. "Mr. Porter, have you been drinking?" "Stone sober," he said. "I know it sounds crazy, but hear me out. I am 30 years old, and I have been alone on that ranch long enough to know that it is not a life I want to keep living. I want a family, Mrs. Kennedy. I want children and someone to share my days with. You need a home and a father for your child. We can help each other." "You do not know anything about me," Adelaide said. "I could be a terrible person. I could be a shrew or a drunk or 100 other awful things." "Thomas thought you were worth marrying," Graham said simply. "That is good enough for me. He was a decent judge of character." Adelaide looked at him, searching his face for signs of madness or deception, but she saw only sincerity and a kind of loneliness that she recognized because it mirrored her own. Still, the whole thing was absurd. People did not get married like this, not even on the frontier where quick marriages were common enough. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you do this for a stranger?" Graham was quiet for a long moment, his fingers working the brim of his hat. "My sister died 2 years ago in childbirth," he finally said. "She was alone because her husband had run off, and she had nowhere to go. She tried to make it work on her own, but it was too much. She died, and the baby died, and I have carried that with me ever since, wondering if things might have been different if someone had helped her. I cannot help Grace anymore, but I can help you. That is reason enough." Adelaide felt tears prick at her eyes. She looked away, not wanting him to see her cry, but the tears came anyway, running hot down her cold cheeks. "Mr. Porter, I do not know what to say." "Say you will think about it," he said. "I am staying at the Grand Central Hotel. You have 3 days before you lose your room, from what I understand. Take those 3 days to think it over, and if you decide yes, come find me. If you decide no, I will respect that and leave you in peace." "And if I say yes," Adelaide asked, "what would you expect from me?" "I would expect you to be my wife in all the ways that matter," Graham said. "I would expect you to help run the ranch and raise the children and be my partner in building a life. But I would not expect anything else until you were ready. You would have your own room, and I would not press you for anything you did not want to freely give. That is a promise." Adelaide looked at him, this strange man with kind eyes who had appeared in her life like an answer to a prayer she had been too proud to speak aloud. It was madness, but then again, what choice did she have? She could go west to the coast and try to find work in San Francisco, but that took money she did not have. She could try to make it through the winter in Deadwood, but that seemed impossible. Or she could accept this unlikely offer and see where it led. "I will think about it," she said finally. "I promise I will truly consider it." "That is all I ask," Graham said. He put his hat back on and tipped it to her. "Good night, Mrs. Kennedy. I hope to see you again soon." He walked down the steps and disappeared into the darkness, leaving Adelaide standing on the porch with her heart pounding and her mind racing. Mrs. Harrison came out from the doorway, her face pinched with disapproval. "I heard enough of that to know that man is either a saint or a scoundrel," she said. "You would be wise to figure out which before you do anything foolish." Adelaide went back to her room and lay awake most of the night, turning Graham Porter's offer over in her mind like a puzzle she could not quite solve. By morning, she had not reached a decision, but she had at least narrowed down her options. She could accept his offer, or she could try to make it on her own. There was no third choice, no miracle waiting in the wings to save her. She spent the next day making inquiries around town, asking if anyone knew anything about Graham Porter. What she learned was sparse but consistent. He had been in the area for about 5 days, staying quietly at the hotel and asking questions about Thomas Kennedy. No one had a bad word to say about him, but then again, no one seemed to know much about him at all. He paid his bills on time, he was polite to everyone, and he kept to himself. That was the extent of what she could discover. On the second day, Adelaide walked past the Grand Central Hotel 3 times, trying to work up the courage to go inside. Each time, she lost her nerve and kept walking. The child moved in her belly, a flutter of life that reminded her she was not making this decision just for herself. She had another life to think about now, a child who deserved better than to be born in the street or in some frontier orphanage. That evening, she sat in her room and wrote a letter to Thomas, even though he would never read it. She told him about Graham Porter and the impossible offer. She told him that she was scared and confused, and that she wished he were still alive to tell her what to do. She told him that she loved him, and that she always would, but that she was running out of options and out of time. When she finished, she burned the letter in the lamp flame and watched the paper curl and blacken, sending her words up to wherever Thomas might be. On the morning of the 3rd day, Adelaide packed her few belongings into the worn carpet bag that had traveled with her from Pennsylvania 5 years ago, when she and Thomas had headed west full of hope and dreams of striking it rich. She settled her account with Mrs. Harrison, handing over the last of her money and feeling the weight of absolute poverty settle on her shoulders like a yoke. Then she walked to the Grand Central Hotel and asked the clerk if Mr. Graham Porter was available. The clerk sent a boy up to Graham's room, and a few minutes later, Graham came down the stairs, his eyes lighting up when he saw her standing there with her bag. "Mrs. Kennedy," he said. "Have you made your decision?" "I have," Adelaide said. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. "Mr. Porter, I will marry you, but I want to be clear about something first. I loved my husband, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. I do not love you, and I may never love you. I will be a good wife and a hard worker, but I cannot promise you my heart." "I do not expect your heart," Graham said quietly. "Not right away, at least. Love takes time, and I am a patient man. All I ask is that you give us a fair chance, and I will do the same." "Then I accept your proposal," Adelaide said. "Good," Graham said, and she saw relief wash over his face. "We can be married this afternoon if you are willing. I already spoke to the preacher and made sure he would be available. We can leave for Wyoming tomorrow morning if the weather holds." Everything moved quickly after that, too quickly for Adelaide to really process what was happening. They went to the church, a small wooden building at the edge of town, where a tired-looking preacher married them in a ceremony that took less than 10 minutes. Graham had found 2 witnesses, men he had met at the hotel, and they stood awkwardly through the brief service. Adelaide spoke her vows in a voice that sounded strange to her own ears, and when Graham slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, she had to fight the urge to run. But she did not run. She stood beside this stranger who was now her husband, and tried to believe that she had made the right choice. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Graham did not kiss her, but instead took her hand and squeezed it gently, as if to say that everything would be all right. They had dinner that evening in the hotel dining room, a quiet meal where they made awkward conversation about practical matters. Graham told her about the ranch, about the cattle and horses he raised, about the small house that needed a woman's touch. Adelaide told him about her life before Thomas died, carefully editing out the darker parts, the fears and failures that she was not ready to share. They were like actors reading lines from a script, playing the roles of husband and wife without really knowing what those roles meant yet. That night, Graham got a second room at the hotel, despite Adelaide's protests that they could not afford the expense. "We are married now, and married couples share a room," she had said, but Graham shook his head. "Not until you are ready," he said firmly. "I made you a promise, Adelaide, and I intend to keep it. You have been through enough these past few days without me adding to your burdens. Get some rest. We have a long journey ahead of us tomorrow." Adelaide went to her room and lay in the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling and trying to understand what she had just done. She was married to a man she did not know, carrying another man's child, and about to leave the only town she had known for the past year to travel to a ranch in Wyoming that might not even exist. It was the kind of foolishness that her mother would have lectured her about for hours, but her mother was 3 years dead, and Adelaide was on her own in the world, making the best choices she could with the limited options available to her. They left Deadwood at first light, with Graham driving a sturdy wagon pulled by 2 good horses. He had bought supplies for the journey, and Adelaide was grateful to see that he had not scrimped on food or blankets. The road south was rough, following old mining trails through the Black Hills before joining up with the main route to Cheyenne. Graham had estimated the trip would take about a week if the weather held, and they did not run into trouble. The first day passed in relative silence. Adelaide was exhausted from the stress of the past few days, and she dozed in the wagon seat as they rolled through the pine-covered hills. Graham did not press her for conversation, instead keeping his attention on the horses and the road. By evening, when they made camp beside a small creek, Adelaide was feeling more rested and a bit more inclined to talk. "Tell me about Grace," she said as they sat by the fire after supper. "Your sister. What was she like?" Graham was quiet for so long that Adelaide thought he might not answer. Finally, he poked at the fire with a stick and said, "She was the best person I ever knew, kind and funny and braver than she should have been. When our parents died, she helped raise me, even though she was only 16 herself. She got married young to a man who seemed decent enough, but he turned out to be no good. When she got pregnant, he ran off with another woman, leaving Grace with nothing. She was too proud to ask for help, and by the time I found out how bad things were, it was too late. "I am sorry," Adelaide said softly. "That must have been terrible." "It was," Graham said. "And it taught me that pride can be just as dangerous as any bullet or blade. Grace died because she was too proud to tell me she needed help. I do not want to see that happen to anyone else if I can prevent it." "Is that really why you married me?" Adelaide asked. "Because of your sister, partly," Graham admitted, "but also because I meant what I said about wanting a family. I have been alone too long, Adelaide. A ranch is meant to be shared, and a life without someone to share it with starts to feel pretty hollow after a while. When I heard about your situation, it seemed like we could help each other. You needed a home, and I needed a family. It is not the most romantic reason to get married, I suppose, but it is honest." "Honest is good," Adelaide said. "I have had enough of pretty lies and false promises. Thomas and I married for love and we were happy, but love did not keep the roof from caving in on him. Love did not pay the boarding house bill or put food in my belly. Maybe a practical marriage is better than a romantic one." "Maybe it can be both," Graham said, "given time." Adelaide looked at him across the fire, seeing him clearly for the first time. He was handsome in a rough-hewn way, with good strong features and those unusual eyes. But more than that, he seemed steady and reliable, like a foundation a woman could build a life on. She had loved Thomas with all her heart, but if she was honest with herself, Thomas had been a dreamer, always chasing the next big opportunity, never quite satisfied with what he had. Graham seemed different, more grounded, more content with a simple life well lived. "Can I ask you something?" Adelaide said. "Why did you never marry before now? You are 30 years old and you own a ranch. You must have had opportunities." Graham smiled slightly. "I did a few times, but after Grace died, I was not in a good place for a while. I blamed myself for not being there when she needed me, and I did not feel like I deserved to be happy. It took me a long time to work through that. By the time I did, most of the available women in the area had married other men, and I was too shy to go courting in town. So I stayed on the ranch and told myself I was fine alone, but I was not. Not really." "And what made you decide to come to Deadwood looking for me?" Adelaide asked. "I was in Cheyenne buying supplies when I heard about Thomas dying in the mine collapse," Graham said. "Someone mentioned that he had left behind a pregnant wife with no family and no money. I kept thinking about it, about how similar it was to Grace's situation. It kept me up at night, wondering if that woman was going to end up like my sister. Finally, I decided I had to at least try to help. So I packed up and headed north. I did not really have a plan beyond offering assistance. The marriage proposal came to me on the way to Deadwood. It seemed like the best solution for everyone." They talked until the fire burned low, sharing small details about their lives, beginning the slow process of getting to know each other. When they finally settled in for the night, Graham gave Adelaide all the blankets except one and slept on the opposite side of the fire, as far from her as the camp allowed. It was such a considerate gesture that Adelaide felt a small crack form in the wall she had built around her heart. The days on the trail began to fall into a rhythm. They would wake at dawn, have a quick breakfast, and then travel until late afternoon, when Graham would find a good spot to make camp. In the evenings, they would talk while Adelaide prepared dinner from the supplies Graham had bought. She learned that he was an excellent horseman and a skilled tracker. that he could read the weather in the clouds and find water in the driest country. He learned that she had grown up in Pittsburgh, that she could read and write and do figures, that she had once wanted to be a teacher before her father died and left the family with nothing. On the fourth day out from Deadwood, they passed through the town of Lusk, a small settlement where they stopped to rest the horses and buy fresh bread. While Graham was at the livery, Adelaide went into the general store to buy thread and needles. Her dresses were starting to strain across her growing belly, and she needed to let out the seams before they burst. The woman behind the counter was friendly, making small talk about the weather and the price of goods. "You and your husband traveling far?" she asked as she wrapped Adelaide's purchases. "To his ranch near Cheyenne," Adelaide said, and realized with a start that it was the first time she had referred to Graham as her husband without feeling like she was lying. "That is a good long journey for a woman in your condition," the shopkeeper said, glancing at Adelaide's belly. "When are you due?" "Late March, I think," Adelaide said. "Maybe early April." "Well, you take care of yourself, dear, and make sure that husband of yours does not push you too hard." Men do not always understand that women need extra rest when they are carrying. Adelaide thanked her and left the store, feeling oddly warmed by the woman's concern. It had been a long time since anyone had spoken to her with such casual kindness, without judgment or pity in their voice. The women in Deadwood had mostly avoided her after Thomas died, as if widowhood were a contagious disease they might catch. That evening, as they made camp beside a shallow river, Adelaide found herself watching Graham as he tended to the horses. He moved with quiet efficiency, checking their hooves and brushing their coats with a gentleness that surprised her. These were not expensive animals, just working horses, but he treated them with the same care he might have shown to prize thoroughbreds. "You are good with them," Adelaide said, coming to stand beside him. "Horses respond to how you treat them," Graham said. "They know if you care about them or if you just see them as tools. These two have carried us a long way without complaint. The least I can do is make sure they are comfortable." "Is that how you see people too?" Adelaide asked. "That they respond to how you treat them?" Graham looked at her, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I suppose so. I think most folks just want to be treated with basic kindness and respect. It is not complicated." "You make it sound simple," Adelaide said, "but people are not as straightforward as horses." "No," Graham agreed, "but the principle is the same. Treat someone with kindness and patience, and more often than not, they will return it. Treat them poorly and they will either fight back or shut down. Either way, nobody wins." Adelaide thought about that as she prepared dinner. Thomas had been kind to her, but he had also been absent-minded and impractical, more concerned with his dreams of striking gold than with the daily work of building a life. Graham seemed different, more focused on the here and now, on making sure the animals were fed and the camp was secure and his wife was comfortable. It was not romantic, but it was steady, and Adelaide was beginning to see the value in that. On the sixth day, they hit their first real trouble. They had been making good time through rolling grassland when one of the wagon wheels hit a hidden rock and cracked badly. Graham managed to stop the horses before the wheel broke completely, but it was clear they could not continue without repairs. "How bad is it?" Adelaide asked, climbing down from the wagon to inspect the damage. "Bad enough that we need to fix it before we go any further," Graham said, running his hand along the crack. "I have tools and a spare piece of wood, but it is going to take me a few hours to make a proper repair. We might as well make camp here for the night." Adelaide looked around. They were in the middle of open country with no trees for shelter and no water in sight. "Are you sure we should stay here? It does not seem like the best place to camp." "I saw a creek about a mile back," Graham said. If you do not mind walking, you could take the canteens and fill them while I work on the wheel. There is a rifle in the wagon if you are comfortable carrying it." Adelaide was not particularly comfortable with guns, but she nodded anyway. She took the canteens and the rifle and started walking back the way they had come, following the wheel ruts in the dirt. The afternoon sun was warm on her back, and she found herself enjoying the walk, the chance to stretch her legs after hours sitting in the wagon. She found the creek without trouble, a small stream running clear over smooth stones. She was kneeling beside it, filling the second canteen, when she heard voices. She looked up to see 3 men on horseback riding toward her from the north. They were rough-looking, unshaven and dusty, with the kind of eyes that made her grip the rifle a little tighter. "Well, what do we have here?" the first man said, pulling his horse to a stop a few feet away. "A lady all alone by the creek. That does not seem safe, madam. There are all kinds of dangers out here on the plains." "My husband is just up the road," Adelaide said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I am only getting water." "Your husband," the second man said, looking around theatrically. "I do not see any husband. Do you see a husband, Jake?" "Not a one," Jake said, grinning to show broken teeth. "Maybe this lady is lying to us. Maybe she is out here all alone, just waiting for some friendly company." Adelaide stood up, the rifle in her hands, though she was not sure she would be able to use it if she had to. "My husband is expecting me back any minute. If I do not return, he will come looking for me." "Then maybe we should all go meet this husband of yours," the third man said. He was older than the other 2, with gray in his beard and a mean look in his eyes. "I am curious to see what kind of man leaves his pregnant wife to wander around alone." They started to dismount, and Adelaide felt panic rising in her chest. She had no idea if the rifle was even loaded, and even if it was, she did not know if she could actually shoot someone. But before the men could get off their horses, a voice called out from behind her. "The kind of man who trusts his wife to handle herself," Graham said, walking up with his own rifle held casually in the crook of his arm. "And the kind of man who does not take kindly to strangers bothering her." The 3 men looked at Graham, reassessing. He was alone, but he carried himself with confidence, and his rifle was not just for show. The older man narrowed his eyes. "We did not mean any harm," he said, "just making friendly conversation." "Then you have said your hellos and you can be on your way," Graham said. His voice was calm, but there was steel underneath it. "My wife and I have a long journey ahead of us, and we do not have time for visitors." The men exchanged looks, clearly debating whether it was worth pushing the issue. Finally, the older man nodded and urged his horse forward. "We will be going then. You folks have a safe trip now." They rode off, heading south at a leisurely pace that suggested they were not particularly worried about Graham and his rifle. Adelaide let out a breath she had not realized she was holding and found that her hands were shaking. "Are you all right?" Graham asked, coming to stand beside her. "I am fine," Adelaide said, though her voice wavered. "I thought I was fine, but I am fine now that you are here." "I heard their horses and came as fast as I could," Graham said. "I should not have let you go off alone. That was poor judgment on my part." "You could not have known," Adelaide said, "and I insisted I could manage." "Still," Graham said, "we are in the middle of nowhere and there are all kinds of people on these roads. From now on we stick together, all right?" Adelaide nodded, grateful for his presence and his steady calm. They walked back to the wagon together, and Graham finished repairing the wheel while Adelaide prepared a cold dinner from their supplies. Neither of them felt much like building a fire after the encounter with the 3 men. That night, Graham moved his bedroll closer to Adelaide's, placing himself between her and the road. "Just in case those men decide to come back," he said. "I do not think they will, but I would rather be safe." Adelaide lay awake for a long time, listening to the sounds of the prairie at night and thinking about how Graham had appeared at just the right moment, how he had stood between her and danger without hesitation. It was not the grand romantic gesture of a storybook hero, but it was real and solid, and it made her feel safer than she had felt in a long time. The next morning, they broke camp early and pushed hard to make up for lost time. By evening, they could see the lights of Cheyenne in the distance, twinkling in the gathering dusk. Adelaide felt a mixture of relief and nervousness. They had made it to Wyoming, to the place that would be her new home, but she had no idea what awaited her there. "The ranch is about 10 miles west of town," Graham said, seeing her looking at the lights. "We will stop in Cheyenne tonight, get a proper meal and a hotel room, and head out to the ranch in the morning. That way you can have a good night's sleep before we get there." "You do not have to spend money on a hotel," Adelaide said. "I know you have already spent so much on supplies and the wedding and everything else." "Adelaide," Graham said gently, "you are my wife now. Taking care of you is not an expense. It is my responsibility and my privilege. Besides, I want you to see the ranch for the first time in daylight, not stumbling around in the dark after a long day of travel." They checked into a small but clean hotel on the edge of Cheyenne, and Graham once again got 2 rooms, despite Adelaide's half-hearted protests. They had dinner in the hotel restaurant, and Adelaide was surprised to find that she had an appetite for the first time in weeks. The food was simple but well prepared, and she ate until she was uncomfortably full. "I have not eaten like that since before Thomas died," she said, pushing her plate away. "I did not realize how hungry I was." "You are eating for 2, Graham reminded her. "You need to keep your strength up." After dinner, they walked around the town for a bit, Graham pointing out various landmarks and businesses. Cheyenne was a rail town, bustling and modern compared to the rough mining camp of Deadwood. Adelaide could see the advantages of being so close to the railroad, the access to goods and services that would have been impossible in more remote locations. "You come to town often?" she asked as they walked. "Once or twice a month, usually," Graham said. "To sell cattle or horses, buy supplies, that sort of thing. It is not a long trip, maybe 2 hours each way. You can come with me whenever you like, or I can bring back anything you need." "I would like to come sometimes," Adelaide said, "if that is all right." "Of course it is all right," Graham said. "Adelaide, you are not a prisoner on the ranch. You can come and go as you please. I want you to be happy there." That night, lying in her hotel bed, Adelaide thought about what Graham had said. He wanted her to be happy. It was such a simple thing, but Thomas had never said anything like that. Thomas had wanted her to be supportive of his dreams, to follow him from one failed venture to another, but he had never really asked what would make her happy. Graham was different. Graham seemed to genuinely care about her well-being, not just as a means to an end, but as a person in her own right. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with frost on the ground and mist rising from the horse's breath. They loaded the wagon and headed west, following a well-worn road through the prairie. After about 2 hours, Graham turned off onto a smaller track that led through a narrow valley. They followed it for another mile before the ranch came into view. Adelaide's first thought was that it was prettier than she had expected. The house was a solid log structure with a covered porch and a stone chimney. It was not large, maybe 3 or 4 rooms, but it looked well built and well maintained. Behind the house was a barn, a corral, and several smaller outbuildings. Beyond that, she could see rolling grassland dotted with cattle, and in the distance, the mountains rose up like a protective wall. "Welcome home," Graham said, pulling the wagon to a stop in front of the house. Adelaide climbed down and stood looking at the place that would be her new life. It was quiet here, peaceful in a way that Deadwood had never been. She could hear birds singing and the wind moving through the grass, but no human sounds, no shouting or hammering or the constant noise of civilization pressing in. Graham came to stand beside her. "What do you think?" "It is beautiful," Adelaide said honestly. "I did not expect it to be so peaceful." "Wait until winter," Graham said with a slight smile. "Then it is less peaceful and more buried under 3 feet of snow. But we have good shelter and plenty of firewood, and the house stays warm. You will be comfortable here, Adelaide, I promise." He showed her around, starting with the house. The front door opened into a main room that served as both kitchen and living area, with a large fireplace dominating one wall. The furniture was simple but well made, clearly built by someone who knew what they were doing. There were 2 bedrooms, one larger than the other, and Graham had clearly been sleeping in the smaller one, leaving the larger room empty. "I thought you would want the bigger room," he said. "It gets more sun in the morning and there is space for a cradle when the baby comes. I can sleep in the other room or out in the barn if you would prefer." "The other room is fine," Adelaide said quickly. "You should not have to sleep in the barn in your own house." Graham showed her the rest of the property, introducing her to his 2 horses and the dozen or so cattle grazing in the near pasture. He explained that he had a larger herd up in the summer range, but he had brought the breeding stock down closer to the house for the winter. There were chickens in a coop beside the barn and a vegetable garden that had been put to bed for the season. "I am not much of a gardener," Graham admitted, "but the soil is good, and if you know anything about growing vegetables, I am sure you could do better than I have." "I helped my mother with her garden when I was young," Adelaide said. "I think I remember enough to manage." They spent the rest of the day unloading the wagon and settling Adelaide into the house. Graham had stocked the pantry before leaving for Deadwood, so they had plenty of food, and Adelaide set about making dinner while Graham tended to the animals. It felt strange to be cooking in someone else's kitchen, but Graham had been right about the house being comfortable. It was warm and dry, and the windows let in good light. That evening they sat by the fire after dinner, and Graham pulled out a stack of papers. "I want to make sure everything is legal and proper," he said. "Tomorrow, I will ride into town and file the marriage certificate. I also want to draw up a will that leaves the ranch to you and the baby, just in case anything happens to me." "Graham, you do not have to do that," Adelaide said. "This is your land. You have worked hard for it. And I want to make sure it stays in the family if I am not here to run it," Graham said firmly. "Adelaide, I meant what I said when I proposed. That child you are carrying is going to have my name, and he or she is going to inherit what I have built here. No child of mine is going to grow up with nothing the way I did." Adelaide felt tears prick at her eyes. "You are a good man, Graham Porter." "I am just doing what is right," Graham said. "Now you must be exhausted. Why do not you turn in, and I will bank the fire and make sure everything is locked up for the night." Adelaide went to her room, which Graham had clearly cleaned and prepared for her. There were fresh sheets on the bed, and someone had put wildflowers in a jar on the dresser. She realized with a start that Graham must have picked them before leaving for Deadwood, not knowing if she would even accept his proposal, but wanting to make her feel welcome if she did. She undressed and lay down in the bed, feeling the baby move inside her. "What have we gotten ourselves into?" she whispered to the child, but as she drifted off to sleep, listening to the sounds of Graham moving around in the other room, she felt something she had not felt in a long time. She felt safe. The next few weeks passed in a blur of adjustment and learning. Adelaide threw herself into making the house a home, cleaning and organizing and putting her own stamp on the space. Graham had been right about not being much of a housekeeper. There were cobwebs in the corners and dust on every surface, but the bones of the place were solid, and Adelaide took satisfaction in scrubbing and polishing until everything gleamed. Graham was patient with her, answering her questions about the ranch and the animals and the way things worked. He taught her how to gather eggs from the chickens without getting pecked, how to tell which cows were due to calve soon, how to read the weather in the morning sky. In turn, Adelaide cooked proper meals and mended his clothes and slowly began to feel like she had a purpose beyond just surviving. They were polite to each other, almost formal, maintaining careful boundaries. Graham never entered her room without knocking, and he always made sure to give her space and privacy. Adelaide appreciated his consideration, but she also found herself wondering what it would be like if they were a real married couple, not just two people sharing a house for convenience. One evening, about 3 weeks after they arrived at the ranch, Adelaide was washing dishes when she felt a particularly strong movement from the baby. She gasped and put her hand on her belly, and Graham looked up from the harness he was mending. "Are you all right?" he asked, concern in his voice. "I am fine," Adelaide said. "The baby is just very active tonight." Graham hesitated, then set aside his work and came to stand beside her. "Can I feel?" he asked quietly. "I have never felt a baby move before." Adelaide looked at him, seeing the wonder and uncertainty in his eyes, and she made a decision. "Give me your hand," she said. She took his hand and placed it on her belly, pressing his palm flat against the place where the baby was kicking. They stood like that for a long moment, waiting, and then the baby kicked again, a solid thump against Graham's hand. His face lit up with amazement. "That is incredible," he said softly. "There is a whole person in there just waiting to come into the world." "There is," Adelaide agreed. "Sometimes I forget, and then I feel that and remember that my life is never going to be the same again." "Are you scared?" Graham asked, his hand still on her belly. "Terrified," Adelaide admitted. "My mother died when I was 18, so I do not have anyone to ask about what to expect. Thomas and I were going to find a midwife in Deadwood, but then he died, and I did not know what I was going to do." "There is a good midwife in Cheyenne," Graham said. "Mrs. Patterson. She has delivered most of the babies in the county for the past 20 years. I will take you to meet her next week, and she can tell you what to expect and what you will need. And when your time comes, I will go get her, no matter what the weather is like. You are not going to go through this alone, Adelaide. I promise you that." Adelaide felt tears spill down her cheeks, and she did not bother to wipe them away. "Why are you so kind to me?" she asked. "I have done nothing to deserve it." "You do not have to deserve kindness," Graham said. "It is not something you earn. It is just something people should give each other freely." He withdrew his hand from her belly and stepped back, giving her space. "Now finish up those dishes and get some rest. You have been working too hard and you need to take care of yourself." The visit to Mrs. Patterson the following week went better than Adelaide had hoped. The midwife was a brisk, no-nonsense woman who examined Adelaide thoroughly and pronounced both her and the baby healthy. She gave Adelaide a long list of instructions about what to eat and what to avoid, what symptoms to watch for, and what to expect as her time drew closer. "Your husband seems like a good man," Mrs. Patterson said as they were leaving. "He is lucky to have you, and you are lucky to have him. Not every man would take on another man's child the way he has." Adelaide wanted to explain that the circumstances were more complicated than that, but she just nodded and thanked the midwife for her time. As she and Graham rode back to the ranch, she found herself thinking about what Mrs. Patterson had said. Graham had taken on another man's child without hesitation, without asking for anything in return beyond the chance to build a family. It was the kind of selfless generosity that Adelaide had rarely encountered in her life. What are you thinking about?" Graham asked, noticing her silence. "Just about how strange life is," Adelaide said. "6 weeks ago, I was alone and desperate and terrified. Now I am married to a man I barely know, living on a ranch in Wyoming, and somehow everything feels like it is going to be all right. I do not understand how that happened." "Sometimes life works out in unexpected ways," Graham said. "I spent years thinking I would die alone on this ranch, and now I have a wife and a child on the way. If you had told me 6 months ago that this is where I would be, I would not have believed you." "Do you ever regret it?" Adelaide asked. "Marrying me, I mean. Do you ever wish you had found a woman who could love you properly instead of a widow still mourning her husband?" Graham was quiet for a long moment. "I will not lie and say I would not like it if you loved me," he finally said. "But I do not regret marrying you, Adelaide, not for a single moment. You have brought life to that house and hope to my days, and that is more than I had before. As for love, well, I figure that is something we can work toward. It does not have to happen all at once." As winter settled in over the ranch, Adelaide found herself thinking more and more about Graham's words. They were working towards something, building a life together brick by careful brick. It was not the passionate romance she had shared with Thomas, but it was solid and real, and she was beginning to appreciate the value of that. She was also beginning to appreciate Graham himself. He was unfailingly considerate, always thinking of her comfort and her needs. When she mentioned that she missed having fresh bread, he rode into town the next day and brought back yeast and better flour. When she said she was cold at night, he spent an entire day chopping extra firewood and banking the fire in her room before she went to bed. When she struggled to reach something on a high shelf, he built her a sturdy step stool and placed it in the kitchen where she could easily find it. These were small things, practical things, but they added up to a picture of a man who cared deeply about the people in his life. Adelaide found herself watching him more and more, noticing the way he moved with quiet confidence, the way he spoke gently to the animals, the way his face softened when he looked at her growing belly. One snowy evening in late December, they were sitting by the fire after dinner when Graham said, "I have been thinking about the baby." "What about the baby?" Adelaide asked, setting aside her mending. "Well, I know the child is not mine by blood," Graham said carefully. "But I want to be a real father, not just a name on a birth certificate. I want to be there for the first words and the first steps and all the other firsts. I want to teach him or her to ride and rope and all the things a parent should teach a child. But I do not want to overstep or make you uncomfortable." "Graham," Adelaide said softly, "you are not overstepping. You have done more for this child already than many fathers do for their own flesh and blood. When this baby is born, you are going to be their father in every way that matters." Graham smiled, and Adelaide realized it was the first time she had seen him truly smile, not just the small, polite expressions he usually offered, but a genuine smile of joy and relief. "Thank you," he said. "That means more to me than you know." "I should be thanking you," Adelaide said. "I do not know where I would be right now if you had not come to Deadwood, probably dead in a ditch somewhere or worse." "Do not say that," Graham said firmly. "You are stronger than you think, Adelaide. You would have found a way to survive. You just should not have had to do it alone." As Christmas approached, Graham cut down a small pine tree and set it up in the main room, and Adelaide decorated it with strings of popcorn and paper ornaments she made from old newspapers. It was a modest celebration, but it felt right, cozy and warm in the little house while snow piled up outside. On Christmas morning, Graham surprised Adelaide with a gift, a beautiful shawl made of soft blue wool. "I know you have been cold," he said, "and I saw this in town last week and thought the color would suit you." Adelaide was touched beyond words. She had not expected a gift, had not even thought about Christmas presents in the chaos of the past few months. She had nothing to give Graham in return, and she felt terrible about it. "I am sorry," she said. "I did not get you anything. I did not think. You have given me more than you know," Graham said, cutting her off gently. "You have given me a reason to celebrate Christmas instead of just letting the day pass like any other. That is gift enough." They spent the day quietly, cooking a special dinner and talking by the fire. Adelaide told stories about Christmases from her childhood, and Graham shared memories of holidays with his sister. It was peaceful and pleasant, and Adelaide realized that she was happy, truly happy, for the first time since Thomas had died. As the new year arrived, Adelaide's belly continued to grow, and she found herself becoming more awkward and uncomfortable. Graham adapted without complaint, taking on more of the household chores and constantly asking if she needed anything. He built a comfortable chair with extra cushions for her to sit in, and he made sure the fire was always well stoked so she would not get cold. One evening in late January, Adelaide was struggling to get her boots on when Graham came in from feeding the animals. He saw her difficulty and immediately knelt down in front of her. "Let me help," he said, taking her foot gently and sliding the boot on. He laced it up and then did the same with the other boot, his hands quick and efficient. "I feel like such a burden," Adelaide said, frustrated with her own limitations. "I cannot even put on my own boots anymore." "You are not a burden," Graham said, looking up at her. "You are growing a human being inside your body. That is hard work, Adelaide. Let me do the easy things like putting on boots." "You are too good to me," Adelaide said softly. "I am exactly as good to you as I should be," Graham said. He stood up and offered her his hand to help her to her feet. "Now come sit by the fire. I will make tea." As he moved around the kitchen, preparing tea and talking about his plans for the spring calving season, Adelaide watched him and felt something shift inside her chest. It was not the wild, passionate love she had felt for Thomas, but it was something deeper and more enduring. It was trust and respect and gratitude and affection all tangled up together, and it felt like the foundation of something that could last a lifetime. That night, after Graham had gone to his room, Adelaide sat by the fire and thought about her feelings. She was falling in love with her husband, slowly and carefully, like learning to walk after an injury. It was not the dramatic sweep of emotion she had expected, but it was real, and it was growing stronger every day. She thought about telling him, but she was not ready yet. She wanted to be sure, wanted to know that what she felt was genuine and not just gratitude or loneliness. So she kept her feelings to herself and continued to build their life together, one day at a time. February brought heavy snows that kept them confined to the house for days at a time. Graham had been right about being prepared. They had plenty of food and firewood, and the house stayed warm and dry even when the wind howled outside. Adelaide used the time to prepare for the baby, sewing clothes and blankets from fabric Graham had bought on his last trip to town. They spent long evenings together, talking about everything and nothing. Graham told her about his childhood, about growing up poor and struggling to survive after his parents died. Adelaide shared memories of her life in Pennsylvania, of the factory where her father had worked and the small apartment where she had grown up. They talked about their hopes for the future, about the kind of life they wanted to build on the ranch. "I want more children," Graham said one evening. "I know that is a lot to ask, especially since you are about to go through childbirth for the first time, but I want a big family. 3 or 4 kids at least, running around and making noise and filling up this house with life." Adelaide looked at him, surprised and touched by the longing in his voice. "I would like that too," she said. I always wanted brothers and sisters when I was growing up, but my mother could not have any more children after me. I used to feel so lonely sometimes. Our children will never be lonely, Graham said firmly. They will have each other, and they will have parents who love them and each other. That is the most important thing. The mention of loving each other hung in the air between them, and Adelaide wondered if Graham had meant it the way it sounded, or if he was still talking about the theoretical future they were building. Before she could decide whether to say anything, Graham stood up and stretched. "I should check on the animals one more time before bed," he said. "Make sure everyone is settled for the night." He pulled on his coat and boots and went out into the cold, leaving Adelaide alone with her thoughts and the fire. March arrived with a false spring, warm days that melted the snow and made everyone think winter was over. Graham warned Adelaide not to trust it. "We will get at least one more big storm," he said. "Maybe two. It is always this way in Wyoming. Winter does not give up without a fight." He was right. In mid-March, a blizzard came roaring down from the north, bringing wind and snow that made it impossible to see more than a few feet. Graham spent most of the storm out in the barn with the animals, making sure they had food and water and that the pregnant cows were comfortable. He would come in every few hours, half frozen, and Adelaide would wrap him in blankets and force hot soup into him before he went back out. By the time the storm passed, Adelaide was 8 months along and feeling every day of it. She was exhausted all the time, and her back ached constantly. Graham did everything he could to help, but there was only so much he could do to ease the discomfort of late pregnancy. "I do not know how women do this more than once," Adelaide said one evening, trying to find a comfortable position in her chair. "I feel like I am carrying a boulder inside me." "You are carrying our child," Graham said gently, "and you are doing an amazing job of it. I know it is hard, Adelaide, but it will be over soon and we will have a beautiful baby to show for it." "Easy for you to say," Adelaide grumbled. "You do not have to do any of the hard part." "I know," Graham said, "and if I could take some of the burden from you, I would. But since I cannot, I will just have to settle for being there for you in whatever way I can." Adelaide felt tears prick at her eyes, which seemed to happen constantly these days. "I am sorry," she said. "I know I am being difficult. I do not mean to complain." "You are not being difficult," Graham said. "You are being human, and you have every right to complain. Growing a person is hard work, and you do not have to pretend it is easy just to make me feel better." He came and knelt beside her chair, taking her hand in his. "Adelaide, I know we got married for practical reasons, and I know you may never feel about me the way you felt about Thomas, but I want you to know that I care about you deeply. You are not just a convenience or a means to an end. You are my wife, and I am grateful every day that you took a chance on me." Adelaide looked down at him, seeing the sincerity in his eyes, and felt the last of her defenses crumble. "Graham," she said softly, "I need to tell you something." "What is it?" he asked, concern crossing his face. "I love you," Adelaide said. The words came out in a rush before she could second-guess herself. "I do not know when it happened exactly, but somewhere along the way I fell in love with you. Not the way I loved Thomas, but in a different way that feels just as real and maybe even more lasting. You have been so good to me, so patient and kind, and I do not want you to think that I am just grateful or obligated. I love you, Graham Porter, and I wanted you to know that before the baby comes." Graham stared at her for a long moment, and Adelaide saw tears gathering in his eyes. Then he stood up and pulled her gently into his arms, holding her as carefully as if she were made of glass. "I love you too," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I have loved you almost from the beginning, but I did not want to pressure you or make you feel like you had to return my feelings. Adelaide, you have made me happier than I ever thought I could be. You and this baby are my whole world." They stood like that for a long time, holding each other while the fire crackled and the wind whispered around the house. When they finally pulled apart, Graham cupped Adelaide's face in his hands and kissed her, gentle and sweet, a promise of all the days to come. That night, Adelaide moved her things into Graham's room and they lay together in the narrow bed, talking until late and holding each other close. It was not about passion or desire, not with Adelaide so pregnant and uncomfortable, but about intimacy and connection, and the deep satisfaction of being with someone who truly saw you and loved you anyway. "I want to do this right," Graham said as they lay in the darkness. "I want to be the kind of husband you deserve, and the kind of father this baby needs. I want to build a good life with you, Adelaide, full of love and laughter and all the things that make life worth living." "You already are doing that," Adelaide said. "Every single day you are doing that." 2 weeks later, on a warm April morning, Adelaide woke up with contractions. Graham immediately saddled his fastest horse and rode into Cheyenne to fetch Mrs. Patterson. He made the 2-hour ride in just over an hour, and by the time he got back with the midwife, Adelaide's labor was well underway. Graham wanted to stay with her, but Mrs. Patterson shooed him out of the room. "This is women's work," she said firmly. "You go make yourself useful elsewhere. We will call you when the baby is here." So Graham paced the main room, wearing a path in the floorboards while he listened to Adelaide's cries from the bedroom. Every sound made him wince, wishing there was something he could do to ease her pain. It was the longest afternoon of his life, but finally, just as the sun was setting, he heard a new sound, a baby crying. He rushed to the bedroom door and knocked frantically. Mrs. Patterson opened it a crack, her face tired but smiling. "You have a healthy baby boy," she said. "And your wife did wonderfully. Give us just a few more minutes to clean them both up, and then you can come in." Those few minutes felt like hours, but finally the door opened again and Graham was allowed into the room. Adelaide was propped up in bed, pale and exhausted but smiling, with a tiny bundle in her arms. Graham approached slowly, hardly daring to breathe, and looked down at his son. The baby was red and wrinkled and perfect, with a shock of dark hair and tiny fists waving in the air. He was still crying lustily, announcing his arrival to the world with impressive volume. "You want to hold him?" Adelaide asked, and Graham nodded, unable to speak around the lump in his throat. She showed him how to support the baby's head, and Graham took his son into his arms for the first time. The baby stopped crying almost immediately, seeming to sense the safety of his father's embrace. Graham looked down at the tiny face and felt his heart expand in a way he had not known was possible. "Hello there, little one," he said softly. "I am your father, and I am so happy you are here." "What should we name him?" Adelaide asked. "I was thinking maybe Thomas, after his birth father, but Graham for his middle name, after the man who will actually raise him." Graham looked up at her, his eyes shining with tears. "Are you sure? I do not want to erase Thomas's memory." "You are not erasing anything," Adelaide said. "You are honoring both the man who gave him life and the man who will give him a home and a family. Thomas Graham Porter, what do you think?" "I think it is perfect," Graham said. He looked back down at the baby who had fallen asleep in his arms. "Welcome to the family, Thomas Graham Porter. We are going to take such good care of you." Mrs. Patterson stayed for 2 more days, making sure Adelaide was healing properly and teaching both of them how to care for a newborn. She pronounced them natural parents and left with instructions to send for her if there were any problems. The first few weeks with a new baby were exhausting and overwhelming and wonderful all at once. Little Thomas was a good baby for the most part, but he still needed to eat every few hours, day and night. Adelaide was healing well, but she was tired all the time, and Graham did everything he could to help, changing diapers and walking the floor with the baby and bringing Adelaide food and water while she nursed. "You are so good with him," Adelaide said one morning, watching Graham rock the baby back to sleep after a feeding. "You are a natural father." "He makes it easy," Graham said, looking down at the sleeping infant with obvious love. "Look at him, Adelaide, he is perfect." As spring turned into summer, they settled into a new routine. Graham worked the ranch during the day while Adelaide cared for the baby and the house. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch together, taking turns holding Thomas and watching the sun set over the mountains. It was a simple life, but it was full and rich, and everything Adelaide had never known she wanted. One evening in late June, as they sat on the porch with the baby sleeping between them, Graham said, "I have been thinking about the future." "What about it?" Adelaide asked, leaning her head on his shoulder. "I want to expand the ranch," Graham said. "Not too much, just enough that we can be more comfortable. I want to hire some help so I do not have to work from dawn to dusk every day. I want to have time to spend with you and Thomas and with the other children when they come." "Other children," Adelaide said, smiling. "You are that confident there will be more." "I am that hopeful," Graham said. He turned to look at her, his eyes serious. "Are you?" "I know childbirth was hard, and I would understand if you did not want to go through it again." "I want more children," Adelaide said firmly. "I want Thomas to have brothers and sisters, and I want to fill this house with love and laughter the way you talked about. It will not be easy, but the best things never are." "You are amazing," Graham said, kissing her softly. "Have I told you that today?" "Not yet," Adelaide said, "but I will never get tired of hearing it." They sat together as the stars came out, planning their future and dreaming their dreams. Thomas woke up and fussed, and they took turns soothing him back to sleep. It was an ordinary evening, nothing special or remarkable, but it was theirs, and it was perfect. The summer passed in a blur of work and family life. Graham hired a young man named Peter to help with the ranch work, which freed up more of his time to spend with Adelaide and Thomas. The baby grew quickly, becoming more alert and responsive every day. By August, he was smiling and cooing, and Graham swore he was the most brilliant baby who had ever lived. Adelaide had never been happier. She had a home, a family, and a husband who loved her unconditionally. The grief over Thomas's death had not disappeared, but it had softened into something she could carry without being crushed by it. She thought about him sometimes, usually when she looked at the baby, but the memories were no longer painful. They were just part of her story, part of what had brought her to this place and this life. In September, the first anniversary of Thomas's death came and went. Adelaide marked it privately, spending a few quiet moments remembering the man she had loved and thanking him for giving her the child that had led her to Graham. Then she let it go and turned her attention back to the present, to the life she was building with her new family. October brought the first hard frost, and with it the busy season of preparing for winter. Graham and Peter worked long hours bringing the cattle down from the summer range and stockpiling firewood and hay. Adelaide spent her days preserving food and making sure the house was ready for the cold months ahead. Thomas was sitting up now, and Adelaide had to watch him constantly to make sure he did not get into trouble. One evening, after Thomas had been put to bed, Adelaide and Graham sat by the fire and she told him news she had been waiting all day to share. "I am pregnant again," she said, watching his face light up with joy. "Really?" he said, pulling her into his arms. "That is wonderful. When?" "Probably next May," Adelaide said. "If my calculations are right, I wanted to be sure before I told you." "May," Graham said, his smile growing even wider. "So Thomas will have a little brother or sister before he is even a year and a half old." They will grow up together, best friends from the beginning. That is what I thought too, Adelaide said. I am a little nervous about having two babies so close together, but I know we can manage it. We can manage anything together, Graham said confidently. You and me and Thomas and this new baby. We are building something here, Adelaide. A real family, the kind that lasts forever. The winter was long and hard, with several heavy storms that kept them snowed in for days at a time. But inside the little house, everything was warm and bright. Thomas took his first steps in January, stumbling from Adelaide to Graham with a huge smile on his face. They both cheered and clapped, celebrating the milestone with the enthusiasm it deserved. In late May, just as the wildflowers were starting to bloom across the prairie, Adelaide gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Grace Adelaide, after Graham's beloved sister and after Adelaide herself. Graham cried when he held his daughter for the first time, overcome with emotion at the perfection of this tiny person who carried his sister's name. Grace would have loved her, he said to Adelaide as they lay together in bed, the baby sleeping between them. She always wanted a niece or nephew to spoil. I wish he could have met her namesake. I think she knows, Adelaide said softly. Somehow, I think she knows and she is happy for us. With two babies under 2 years old, life became even more chaotic and exhausting, but it was the good kind of exhaustion, the kind that came from a life fully lived. Thomas was a sweet older brother, gentle with his baby sister and always wanting to help take care of her. Graham was an attentive father to both children, changing diapers and walking the floor at night and reading stories and singing lullabies. Peter, the hired hand, had become almost like family, eating meals with them and helping Adelaide with the children when Graham was out working. He was young, only 22, but he was reliable and hardworking, and Adelaide was grateful for his presence. The years that followed were full and happy. Thomas grew into a sturdy, confident boy, curious about everything and eager to learn. Grace was more cautious, thoughtful and observant, with her father's gray-green eyes and her mother's determination. In 1884, Adelaide gave birth to another son, whom they named Henry, and in 1886, a second daughter they called Margaret. By the time Thomas was 7 years old, the ranch had grown and prospered. Graham had bought more land and more cattle, and he had built an addition onto the house to accommodate their growing family. Peter had married a girl from Cheyenne and built a house on the far corner of the property, becoming a full partner in the ranch operation. Adelaide stood on the porch one warm summer evening, watching her 4 children play in the yard. Thomas was teaching Grace how to rope a fence post, while Henry toddled after them and Margaret sat in the grass, pulling up handfuls of wildflowers. Graham came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "About how far we have come," Adelaide said. 7 years ago I was alone and desperate and terrified, and now look at all this. A beautiful home, 4 healthy children, a husband I love more than I ever thought possible. It is like a dream, Graham. "It is real," Graham said, holding her tighter. "We built this together, you and me, every bit of it." "Do you ever think about that first day in Deadwood?" Adelaide asked. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had not come looking for me?" "I try not to," Graham said honestly. "It is too terrible to think about. But I am grateful every day that I listened to that voice in my head telling me to go find Thomas Kennedy's widow. It brought me you, and you brought me everything else." They stood together, watching their children and their life, and Adelaide felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. This was what she had been searching for all along, even when she had not known it. Not the wild passion of youth, but the steady, enduring love that came from building a life with someone brick by brick, day by day, choosing each other over and over again. Thomas ran up to the porch, his face flushed with excitement. "Papa, can we go riding tomorrow? I want to check on the cattle in the north pasture." "We can do that," Graham said, ruffling his son's hair. "But only if you finish your chores first thing in the morning." "I will." Thomas promised, and he ran back to his siblings, shouting the good news. "He looks just like you," Adelaide said, watching the boy. "Same walk, same gestures, everything. No one would ever guess he is not your blood." "He is my blood," Graham said firmly. "Not by birth maybe, but by choice. That counts for just as much, if not more. He is my son in every way that matters." As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple, the Porter family gathered on the porch. Graham and Adelaide sat in the rocking chairs they had bought to replace the old ones, while the children sprawled on the floor at their feet. Adelaide held baby Margaret in her lap, and Graham had his arm around Thomas, who was leaning against his father's chair. "Tell us a story, Papa," Grace said. "Tell us about when you and Mama first met." Graham and Adelaide exchanged a look, and Adelaide smiled. This was Grace's favorite story, one she never got tired of hearing. Graham settled back in his chair and began. "Well, it was autumn of 1881, and I was staying in a town called Deadwood in the Black Hills of South Dakota. I heard about a lady who needed help, a widow who was expecting a baby and had nowhere to turn. So I went to see her, and when I met your mama, I knew right away that she was someone special." As Graham told the story, softening some of the harder parts for the children but keeping the essential truth, Adelaide watched her family and felt her heart swell with love. This was her life now, these people and this place. The scared, desperate woman who had opened her boarding house door to a stranger 7 years ago would hardly recognize the woman she had become, but Adelaide liked to think she would be proud. The children listened raptly to the story they had heard a dozen times before, and when Graham got to the part about the wedding, Thomas piped up. "And then Papa said that child will have my name, and that child was me." "That is right," Graham said, pulling his son closer. "That child was you, and I have been proud to call you my son every single day since." After the story was finished and the children had been tucked into bed, Graham and Adelaide returned to the porch, enjoying the cool evening air and the quiet that came with having all 4 children asleep at once. "We should have another one," Graham said suddenly. Adelaide looked at him in surprise. "Another child? Graham, we already have 4. That is more than most families out here." "I know," Graham said, "but you heard what I said all those years ago. I wanted a big family, children running around and filling the house with noise and life. We have that, but I am not quite ready to be done yet. What do you say? One more?" Adelaide thought about it, weighing the exhaustion and work of another pregnancy and infant against the joy of adding another child to their family. It was not a difficult decision. "One more," she agreed. "But after that we are finished. 5 children is plenty even for you." Graham laughed and pulled her into his arms. "Deal," he said. 5 is perfect, although if you happen to give me twins I would not complain." "Do not even joke about that," Adelaide said, but she was smiling. They sat together under the stars, making plans for the future and dreaming about the years to come. The ranch would continue to grow. The children would grow up and probably have children of their own someday, and Graham and Adelaide would grow old together, surrounded by the family and the life they had built from nothing. In the spring of 1888, Adelaide gave birth to their 5th and final child, another son they named Samuel. With 5 children ranging from baby Samuel up to 7-year-old Thomas, the house was never quiet and never still. There were always meals to cook and clothes to wash and disputes to settle and lessons to teach. It was exhausting and chaotic and absolutely perfect. As the years passed, the Porter family became a fixture in the community. They were known for their generosity and their hard work, for the quality of their cattle and the kindness they showed to their neighbors. Graham served on the local school board, working to make sure all the children in the area had access to education. Adelaide became known for her skills as a midwife, helping to deliver dozens of babies in the county over the years, always remembering Mrs. Patterson's kindness to her and paying it forward. Thomas grew into a fine young man, strong and capable and good-hearted like his father. He never knew the circumstances of his birth, or at least if he did, he never mentioned it. As far as he was concerned, Graham Porter was his father in every sense of the word, and that was all that mattered. The other children followed in their brother's footsteps, each finding their own path while remaining close to the family and the ranch. On a warm summer day in 1895, Adelaide and Graham celebrated their 14th wedding anniversary. The children had planned a surprise party, decorating the house with wildflowers and preparing a special dinner. As Adelaide looked around the table at her family, all talking and laughing and enjoying each other's company, she felt tears prick at her eyes. "What is wrong, Mama?" Grace asked, seeing her mother's expression. "Nothing is wrong," Adelaide said, smiling through her tears. "I am just happy. Happier than I ever thought possible. You are all such blessings, every single one of you." After dinner, when the children had gone outside to play in the lingering twilight, Graham took Adelaide's hand and led her out to the porch where they had spent so many evenings over the years. "You remember the day I proposed to you?" he asked. "How could I forget?" Adelaide said. "I thought you were crazy." "I was a little crazy," Graham admitted. "Proposing to a woman I had just met, offering to raise another man's child, it should not have worked." "But it did work," Adelaide said. "Better than either of us could have imagined." "It did," Graham agreed. "And do you know why? Because we both decided to take a chance on each other. We both decided that building a life together was worth the risk of getting hurt or disappointed. And every day since then, we have made that same choice, over and over again. That is what makes a marriage last, Adelaide. Not grand gestures or passionate declarations, but the daily choice to love each other and work together no matter what comes." "When did you get so wise?" Adelaide teased, leaning her head on his shoulder. "I learned it from you," Graham said. "You taught me what it means to be brave enough to start over, to let go of the past and embrace the future. You taught me that love is not just a feeling, but an action, something you do every day through big gestures and small kindnesses. You made me a better man, Adelaide Porter." "And you saved my life," Adelaide said softly. "Not just my physical life, though you did that too. But you saved me from despair and loneliness and a future I could not bear to imagine. You gave me hope when I had none, and you gave my child a name and a home and a father who loved him. I will never be able to repay that debt." "There is no debt," Graham said firmly. "Love is not something you repay, Adelaide. It is something you share freely without keeping score or measuring worth. You have given me just as much as I have given you, maybe more." They sat together as the stars came out, just as they had done hundreds of times before, and Adelaide thought about the twisting path that had brought them to this moment. If someone had told her, back in that boarding house room in Deadwood, that she would one day be sitting on her own porch with a husband she loved and 5 healthy children sleeping inside, she would not have believed them. But here she was, living a life she had not known was possible, and it was more than she had ever dared to dream. The years continued to roll by, bringing changes and challenges, but also joy and growth. The children grew up and started their own lives. Thomas married a teacher from Cheyenne and took over the day-to-day running of the ranch, building a house on the property for his own family. Grace married a rancher from the next county and moved away, though she visited often with her growing brood of children. Henry became a lawyer, studying in Denver and opening a practice in Cheyenne. Margaret surprised everyone by becoming a doctor, one of the first women physicians in Wyoming. And Samuel followed in his father's footsteps, staying on the ranch and working beside his older brother. Through it all, Graham and Adelaide remained the heart of the family, the foundation that everyone else built their lives upon. They grew older together, their hair turning gray and their steps slowing, but their love only deepening with time. They were grandparents now, with more grandchildren than they could easily count, and they delighted in spoiling each and every one of them. On a quiet evening in the autumn of 1910, Adelaide and Graham sat on their porch, wrapped in blankets against the October chill. They were alone for once, with all the children grown and gone to their own homes, though Thomas and his family lived just across the way. "Can you believe it has been almost 30 years since we met?" Adelaide said, her voice soft with memory. "It feels like a lifetime and like yesterday all at once." "It has been a good lifetime," Graham said, "full of love and family and all the things that matter. I would not change a single moment of it." "Not even the hard parts?" Adelaide asked. "The lean years when we barely had enough to eat?" "The winter when Grace was so sick we thought we might lose her. The drought that killed half the cattle? Not even those," Graham said firmly. "Because we got through them together and they made us stronger. Every challenge we faced, every obstacle we overcame, it all became part of the foundation we built our life on. I would not trade any of it, Adelaide. Not one single moment." Adelaide reached over and took his hand, their fingers intertwining in a gesture as familiar as breathing. "I love you, Graham Porter," she said. "I have loved you for almost 30 years, and I will love you for however many years we have left. You are the best thing that ever happened to me." "I love you too," Graham said. "You and the family we built together. That is my legacy, Adelaide. Not the ranch or the cattle or any of the material things. It is the love we share and the children we raised and the life we lived together. That is what matters in the end." They sat together as the sun set behind the mountains one more time, painting the sky in familiar colors. Inside the house, the lamps were lit, casting a warm glow through the windows. Across the way they could see lights in Thomas's house, where their grandchildren were probably getting ready for bed. It was an ordinary evening, nothing special or remarkable, but it was theirs, and it was perfect. The story of the pregnant widow who had nowhere to turn, and the lonely cowboy who said that child would have his name, had become a legend in the family, passed down through the generations as an example of courage and kindness, and the power of love to transform lives. Children and grandchildren would ask to hear it, and Adelaide would tell them, her voice warm with memory, about the day a stranger walked into her life and changed everything. But Adelaide knew the real story was not just about that one moment of desperate hope and unexpected kindness. The real story was about everything that came after, the slow building of trust and love, the daily choice to stand by each other through good times and bad, the commitment to creating a family and a life worth living. That was the story that mattered, the one written not in a single moment but in thousands of small moments, in ordinary days and quiet evenings, and all the mundane magic of a life shared with someone you love. As the stars came out and the night grew cold, Graham helped Adelaide to her feet and they went inside together, closing the door on the darkness and stepping into the warmth and light of the home they had built. It was a fitting end to another day, another chapter in a story that had begun with desperation and hope and had grown into something beautiful and lasting. Their love had started in the most unlikely circumstances, born of necessity and compassion, but it had grown into something real and true and eternal. They had taken a chance on each other when they both had every reason to give up, and they had built a life that exceeded their wildest dreams. It was not always easy, and it was not always perfect, but it was theirs, and that made it everything. And so the pregnant widow and the lonely cowboy lived out their days surrounded by the family they had created, and the love they had nurtured, proving that sometimes the best stories are not about dramatic rescues or passionate romance, but about two people choosing each other every single day and building a life together one moment at a time. Their story became part of the fabric of the community, an inspiration to others facing hard times and difficult choices, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, hope can appear in unexpected forms, and love can grow in the most unlikely soil. The ranch continued to thrive under Thomas's management, passing eventually to his children and then to their children, each generation adding their own chapter to the family story. But through it all, the heart of it remained the same. The love between Adelaide and Graham, the family they had built from nothing, and the courage they had shown in taking a chance on each other when the odds were stacked against them. Years later, when Adelaide and Graham had both passed on to whatever comes next, their descendants would gather at the ranch for reunions and celebrations, and someone would always tell the story of how it all began. They would talk about the pregnant widow who had nowhere to turn, and the lonely cowboy who said that child would have his name. And they would remember the love that had started their family, and the courage it took to build a life on faith and hope and commitment. And somewhere, in whatever realm exists beyond this one, Adelaide and Graham would smile, knowing that their love had created something that would last far beyond their own lives, rippling out through generations, touching lives they would never meet, but who would carry their legacy forward into the future. They had taken their pain and loneliness and fear and transformed it into love and family and home, and that was the greatest achievement of all, the end.